Today, I shall speak on the process of the increasing economic activities of the Western powers and the exploitation of the Chinese wealth by the Western powers during the later part of the 19th century. After the Convention of Peking of 1860, a large number of ports had been opened. These open ports came to be known as the treaty ports. The treaty ports became the enclaves of the Europeans, and ultimately the Europeans established their political and economic power in these enclaves, and a kind of enclave economy had been developed in the treaty ports of China. British and the French government began to give lease of land to their subjects and citizens in the Chinese enclaves. Against enjoying the lease, they had to pay a very nominal amount of ground rent to the Chinese government. Apart from it, they would enjoy certain concessions in the enclaves, including the extraterritorial rights, that is, the right to try their own subjects according to their own land. Moreover, they tried to exploit economically the Chinese people in various ways. The Chinese sovereignty virtually disappeared from these enclaves, and a kind of exploitation became rampant in the enclave economy of China. But the Qing rulers were the official rulers of China, and as the Qing rulers were the official rulers of China, there was a dichotomy in the entire thing. There was open and free ports controlled by the foreigners, and there was a central government controlled by the Qing rulers or the Manchu rulers in China. Particularly, the issue of controlling the tariff system of China was a clear case of encroachment of Chinese sovereignty. In each and every port, the officials called customs commissioners had been appointed, and all of them were foreigners. In paper, they were responsible to the Chinese customs superintendent, a local Chinese official, but in reality, the authority of the British officials counted. They were, in real sense of the term, they were in fact answerable to the British officials and British customs commissioners. So, there were two Chinas, which I shall discuss later on. Another thing was there, the Chinese trade was at that time expanding rapidly, particularly in foreign trade. The rapid growth of external trade was increasing enormously. The Gifu Convention of 1876 gave right of the foreign ships to visit the Yangtze Valley, but officially the Yangtze Valley was not at all open. In about 1885, there were at least 11 steam navigation companies in Canton and Shanghai of China, and most of them had been controlled by the British or the Americans. The introduction of steam navigation companies accelerated the growth of foreign trade in China. Moreover, the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce, purely a British organization, invested a huge amount of capital to explore the economic possibilities in the Yangtze Valley. As I have told that trade became very important at that time. Apart from opium, the trade which flourished most at that time was the coolie traffic. The British and the French particularly, and sometimes the Americans as well, they would recruit the Chinese as contractual laborers, and they would send them mainly to the Latin American countries and the Caribbean island. They had to live in a very inhuman situation and beastly condition, and they were packed into the cargo boats and sent to distant places. Particularly the steam navigation companies and the recruiting agencies profited a lot from the coolie traffic. In fact, increasing economic activities of the Western powers gave rise to two Chinas. In the words of a famous sinologist Jean Chenot, two Chinas were thus juxtaposed. One was the China of the enclaves, highly advanced, westernized, and developed, and the other was the interior China, agricultural, backward, and old feudal China. But in spite of all such developments, the Western trade and Western exploitation still could not destroy the subsistence economy of China, the old and traditional economy, and still then China drew her major resources from them. But one thing must be remembered that the enclave economy was completely separate from the other interior economy of China, and in the interior economy, something like cottage industry, agriculture, these things were quite developed, and still China was continuing in a traditional manner, the interior China.
To whom were the British and French governments giving lease of the Chinese land?
Their citizens, mainly they were traders who were leaving their country and coming to China. They were essentially traders. The British who came here mainly in the early stages they were traders and missionaries. Later IS officers and other civil service men, later they came. But in China there was no structure of British administration. There was no question of coming the bureaucrats for administering China. Mainly they were traders.
So were the Chinese people allowed to enter the British, French and the other foreign countries' enclaves?
Yes. The Chinese people were allowed. They were not only allowed, they were closely associated with the European trade system. They acted as employees, sometimes they acted as partners. In fact, a section of the Chinese bourgeoisie known as the comprador bourgeoisie emerged in China. The comprador bourgeoisie were those who acted as the appendage of European imperialism. They collaborated with the imperialist business politics and they amassed enormous wealth, and illegal wealth accumulation by the compradors made a loophole in the Chinese national resources. They became so rich, and others who'd work as coolies or laborers, they could also enter. But sometimes Chinese bureaucrats, if they wanted to enter into the area for supervising their business strategy and structure, they had been prevented sometimes, though there was no certain law, because on paper China was a sovereign country, but still they were prevented. If any Chinese official thought that your business is not going in a proper manner, he could not enter.
So there were not any strict restrictions like we had in colonial Calcutta in the White Town?
No. There was no strict, because they needed the Chinese help. Particularly the compradors emerged as the close associates and collaborators of the British and French business up to that point.
You were talking about a very flourishing foreign trade. So the flourishing foreign trade, it was obviously the foreigners in the enclaves who benefited from the trade. So was there any system of giving any tax to the Ching rulers?
No, they would not. They introduced their own taxation system in the enclaves, own tariff system in the enclaves, own municipal administration in the enclaves, and particularly they had their even own police in the enclaves. They had no intention to pay any tax to the Ching rulers. Sometimes Ching rulers demanded some taxes, but they had to pay only a very nominal they would pay only a very nominal ground rent, which I have already stated. Very nominal ground rent, nothing else. Traditional subsistence economy of China continued at a level, and increasing Western economic activity and increasing trade could not destroy the traditional economy of China and subsistence economy of China. But the enclaves became enriched, they became advanced. But the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95 brought about a sharp change in the existing system. It was a disastrous defeat for China. China faced a humiliating defeat in the hands of her small neighboring country Japan, and China had to concede several demands. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. China agreed to pay a huge indemnity of 2000 million silver ounces to Japan, along with other unfavorable terms and conditions. Japan also secured the right of establishing factories on the Chinese soil. In fact, the right to set up factories in another country had been signalized as a change in the world imperialist outlook, because export of capital began to replace the export of goods, and it was a very new thing in the history of imperialism as well. The European powers took advantage of the provision of setting up factories on the Chinese soil, and the financial industrial magnates maturing in America, Europe, and Japan, they were in search for new areas of investment, and they wanted to invest in China so long they were interested in the vast market of China. But in this new phase of imperialism, they became interested to invest capital in China, and they forced China to take loan for various ways, for various reasons. Foreign capital came into China not in the form of industries but as foreign loans. As China had to pay a huge war indemnity to Japan, China needed money badly, and European powers like Britain, France, Germany, and Russia came forward to give money and pay loans to China. But how they would get back the money? They would get back the money from the Chinese tariff, as the Chinese tariff system was under the absolute control of the Europeans. So, from the Chinese tariff, they would get back their money. They gave loan, and China repaid it from her tariff. So, there was an enormous deficit in the Chinese budget, and loss of copper created a serious economic crisis in China, and national resources of China gradually dwindled. The Chinese government levied taxes on the common people, and particularly the peasantry had to bear the brunt of the enhanced taxation in China. There was a popular reaction, and the Ching rulers became absolutely unpopular for such reasons. Moreover, the European powers also forced to take China the railway loans. Why they were interested in railway loans? Because it was the European contractors who lay railways in China. It was the European investors who would invest money for railways in China, and they would take back the money which they invested from the profits coming out of the railways in China. China had railways only, but investment, profit, everything had been taken by the European powers. It was a new kind of exploitation, and similar situation occurred in India as well when the railways were constructed. The railway magnates were all British, and they would take the entire money to their own land, and a new phase of drain of wealth then entangled China, and China was entangled not only in a debt trap but also a vicious railway network crippled China economically. Frankly, preparing to slice up China, they wanted to divide China in their own spheres of influence. The European power, imminent prospect of partition, now loomed large over China. China's status as an independent state was on the verge of disappearance, and the imperialist powers had already decided that they would divide China among themselves. In fact, if you see, Hong Kong was already a British colony. At the time of Opium War, British authorities had been established over Hong Kong. Now, the Yangtze Valley was allotted to Britain. Manchuria and Mongolia were given to the Tsarist Russia. France secured her stronghold over Southeast China, and Germany secured a leasehold of eastern Shantung Peninsula for 99 years. So, the scramble for concessions, scramble for power in China led a virtual partition of China. The only difference with other countries was that there was still a sovereign government, Manchu government, at the helm of affairs in Peking, but the government had virtually no power. The scramble for concessions in China led to a new era in the history of China and produced far-reaching social, economic and political effects in China. In the words of a great historian, John Fairbank, it inaugurated a new and more ominous phase of the treaty system because spheres of influence were plainly pathway steps towards making China into congeries of outright European colonies. Fairbank was right. China was virtually a colony not of any particular European power but several European powers. And struggle for concession in China by the Western imperial powers and their effort to exploit economically China went to such a position that it paved the way for later developments in Chinese history. The ruling class in China, they wanted that China must undergo some reforms, and the result of this scramble was the reform movement of 1898. But the poor people of China, they did not believe in reform. They believed that it was not possible for the Ching rulers to make any reforms anymore. They cannot improve the plight of the poor and common people of China by introducing any radical or any conservative reforms. They took resort to revolt, and an anti-foreigner outburst took place in China, which came to be known as the Boxer movement, which broke out in 1900. So, the economic activities of the foreigners were directly responsible for these two important aspects, two important episodes in history. One was the reform movement of 1898, which had been introduced by the ruling classes and the Chinese aristocracy, and the Boxer rebellion, which took place in 1900, which was directed against the foreigners, particularly against the Christian missionaries and European businessmen. In this entire scramble for power, in this entire combination of dividing China into their own spheres of influence, so long United States of America was apparently absent. But it would be a mistake to think that America was not at all interested in China. They also wanted to take advantage of the first Chinese market. Americans also wanted to find out new areas of investment, which is known as the phase of finance capital in the history of world capitalism. That had also been done, but as America thought that she lagged behind the other European power, America then came with the doctrine of open door policy in China, early days of the 20th century. And in my next class, I shall discuss the open door policy in China, which had been introduced by America, which had been declared by America.
The British and the French investors were investing in railways. Did they build railways only in their particular enclaves or in the rest of China as well?
Entire China, not only in the enclaves. And which I have tried to mention, that after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the entire scenario changed. Then the Europeans were not only confined to the enclaves only, when Japan got the right to set up factories in any part of the Chinese soil, the Europeans also wanted to take advantage. You know, in my earlier lecture, when treaty system had been imposed on China, there was a provision of most favored nation. Everybody claimed that I am the most favored nation. Which does it mean? If Germany gets some favoritism from the Chinese ruler, it is automatically applicable to Great Britain, to France, to America, and any other. When Japan took the advantage of setting up factories on the Chinese soil, everybody claimed that we are also going to set up railways and factories and investing money. And in this phase, and not only Britain and France invested, it was Russia, Tsarist Russia also invested for the railways, but Russia had not that capital. And at that time, after the exit of Bismarck in European policy, France and Russia was gradually coming closer. Russia had not that capital to invest. Russia forcibly occupied lands and French financiers supplied the finance. Russia gave the Chinese the security of railways and the investment came from France. And it was a collaborating system of exploitation of the four nations and everybody was equal. It was started by the British during the Opium War, but every nation tried to invest. And it was not investment actually, it was giving forcible loans. You take loans, you are to pay me a lot.
You were talking about the fact that the foreign government, the foreign countries, they were forcing China to take loans. They were forcing the other enclaves to take loans. No, they were forcing the Ching government to take loans.
The enclaves were purely governed by the foreigners. The enclaves, and when the system of loan came, and I am saying it, after 1890s, 94, 95, the entire scenario changed. At that time, there was no difference between the enclaves and the interior China. When Japan got the right to set up factories, who can take loan? The Chinese government can take loan. In the enclaves, the Manchu government or the Qing government had no say. No say. They could not tell anything.
They forced the Qing government to take the loans. Yes. Okay. So when they were forcing the Qing government to take the loans, what for? Because most of the parts were now divided into enclaves.
For that part, it was a new phase of drain of Chinese wealth to their own country. So long they were interested to sell their commodity manufactured in their own countries to sell in the vast Chinese market. Now they wanted to amass enormous wealth from China and drain it to their own countries. If you take loan, you give me more interest, and with the accrued interest and huge profit from the factories, particularly from the railways, all were coming in the hands of the British, French or German capitalists, and the surplus amount they would take to their own country, and the economy of China was shattering gradually. In fact, by taking up loan and being entangled in the debt trap, it was virtually an end of the Qing government. Its existence was at stake and it gave a staggering blow to the Qing government. And after 10 years only, 11 years, that is by the revolution of 1911, the Chinese Republic had been established, and that was an end of the Qing rule in China. The revolution which had been led by the Kuomintang leader Sun Yat-sen. It existed for 10 years after these imperialist activities of the Western powers. Increasing economic activities of the Western powers after 1860 in the beginning was confined to external trade. They were interested to sell the commodities manufactured in their respective countries in the Chinese market. They used forces to occupy the markets, and in no time the open ports known as the treaty ports were turned into the foreign enclaves. In these enclaves, other type of economy had been developed which was known as the coastal enclave economy, But in the coastal areas, ports open for foreign trade. They had a separate kind of economy, and the other kind of economy continued in the interior China. And two Chinas were thus juxtaposed, but this feature continued up to 1890s. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 had brought about a serious and sharp change in the entire development. When Japan secured the right of setting up factories on the Chinese soil, the Europeans came forward with the similar demand. They entangled China into a debt trap. They forced China to take railway loans and also gave huge loan to the Chinese government for repaying the indemnity to Japan. And thus it had been difficult for the Ching rulers to come out of the debt trap, which eventually shattered the Chinese economy. There was an enormous loss in the Chinese coffers, and the treasury of the Chinese state became empty. The government, for increasing its income, wanted to levy new taxes on the common people of China, and real brunt of the enhanced taxation actually fell on the Chinese peasantry. There was again a prospect of revolt. Ultimately, two prospects emerged after the Western economic activities. The aristocracy, they wanted to introduce certain modern reforms in China, which is known as the Great Reform Movement of 1898, and the poor people of China, particularly the peasantry, vagabonds, and the men who lost their jobs for foreign economic activities, they became together, they were united to launch a fight against the Westerners, particularly against the Christian missionaries and the Western traders. And the result was the Boxer Uprising of 1900.